Welcome back to learning about soil science. Today we're going to dive in deeper to understand the science underpinning keeping soils healthy to grow more food. Soil has many important roles in our environment, such as nutrient cycling, filtering our water. Soils are habitat for organisms and house many different organisms that are important for preserving biodiversity. There's so many different organisms in the soil, and some of those have pharmaceutical uses. The world's future medicines are housed in the soil. Soils also hold a lot of water, and that can help prevent flooding in vulnerable areas. Soil also can sequester a lot of carbon. Healthier soils sequester more carbon, and that can help with climate regulation. Today we're going to learn about many important areas of soil science, including the ecological role that soil plays in our environment, and important properties of soil, such as structure, CEC, and air and water space. We're then going to learn about how to classify soils, and you'll learn how to use a soil triangle. We'll also learn about different soil types and the different minerals that cause those properties. We'll learn about clay soils, silty soils, and sandy soils. We'll also learn about the critical role that organic matter plays in keeping soils healthy. We'll also talk about how important it is that soils hold water, and we'll learn a little bit more about the physics of that. We'll also talk about the loss of soil, which can cause a huge problem for our environment. That's called erosion. We'll also briefly cover how nutrients are held in soil, how soil pH is critical for managing nutrients, and the microbes that live in soil. Let's get started with a story about soils and how they interact with our environment. Soils provide the place for plants to grow. Inside of soils is the water and nutrients that plants need to grow. It's also something for the plant to anchor onto and have its roots explore. Plants then harness the energy from the sun using photosynthesis to build plant parts such as leaves and stems and fruit that we consume. We can't directly go to the soil and eat the nutrients. That would be pretty silly, right? But we can eat plants that gather the nutrients from the soil. So this is a part of a system. Plants also produce plant parts that we cannot consume, such as many leaves and grasses. But organisms in our environment, such as livestock or wild animals, do eat those grasses. Some humans choose to consume those meat products, which then in turn they're getting that nutrients from the animal, which came from the plant. We can consume directly plants as well, but we do not eat all that nutrients that came from the plant. For instance, there's waste products from animals along with food waste such as banana peels, and then the parts of the plants that we don't eat, such as the leaves from deciduous trees. This organic matter has nutrients in it, but we can't consume it as people. Plants can't directly take those nutrients either. So there's organisms in the soil, such as bacteria and fungi, that enjoy converting these different organic matters back into the nutrients that plants need. There's some organisms that really like to eat banana peels, some organisms that decompose leaves, and others that can help break down manures so that they can be turned into compost. All of this organic matter, with the help of bacteria and fungi, turns into compost, or black gold. This is nutrient-rich product that can help the plant grow. There's other bacteria in the soil and fungi that help the plant uptake these nutrients, so they can help the plant actually gather these nutrients and uptake them more successfully. So this cycle continues because the nutrients that came from the food waste and manure returns back to the soil so the plant continues to grow and produce more produce for us to eat. Again, that waste goes to those bacteria again, and it then gets converted into compost, recycling that nutrient so that it can be used in the cycle over and over again. This is how the soil system was designed, and when it works like this, it works very well. However, a lot of times where we grow plants, we just keep taking and never giving back to the soil. What I mean by that is the plant, harnessing the energy from the sun and using the nutrients and water in the soil, produces produce and grasses, We consume that along with animals consuming that, and again there's this waste. But rather than that waste being fed to microorganisms, that waste is taken away on a garbage truck, right? And it's taken to a landfill where it's not returned back to the soil. Because the distance between the soil producing that food, there's a few different spots, right? There's middlemen, so there's the farmer that produces that, there's the middlemen, there's the grocery store, there's us consuming it, maybe it's a restaurant, and then us way down the line. So that food waste is not necessarily where the soil is. And it can take some time to take that food waste back to the soil. A lot of times it doesn't get taken back to the soil, it gets taken to the landfill. So what this results in is those bacteria that are naturally in the soil that want to re-break down that nutrients, this banana peel for instance, they start to get sick because they don't have enough food to eat. That causes their populations to decline, to go down, for them to get sick. Those same bacteria still want to help the plant gather nutrients that are in the soil so the plant can grow healthy. But those too become hungry after a time because the plant starts to not do very well. This causes soil degradation, so soils become less healthy because there's less organic matter being added to them. This means that the soils can hold less water and causes huge issues. These bacteria that once helped the plant might be tempted to become pathogens or bad guys because they want to steal from the plant because they can't help the plant anymore. This can be likened to somebody who might be a good person, but when they lose their job, they get really desperate to feed their families and they start stealing. Same with the bacteria. They once helped the plant, but once the times get rough, they lose their job, the plant stops paying them, they want to steal nutrients from the plant, and that can cause them to develop or become plant pathogens over time. That takes many different generations and mutations on the bacteria, so it doesn't just happen overnight. But it can happen if soils are not taken care of. And these soils that are being degraded can hold less water, which causes drought issues, and the land can eventually become unusable. This can even, if left long enough, can cause desertification. Basically, the land is no longer useful for growing food for people. A lot of land around the world has been degraded. This is the world map. The darker the color, the more degraded soils. This should be very alarming because soils are incredibly important, but in many areas of the world, people are forgetting to take good care of the soils. We get so caught up in this consumer society where we want to produce, but it's really important that we reinvest into that soil so that it can continue to feed us, our children, and our children's children. Remember, this cycle is designed to replenish the soil with the organic matter, to recycle those nutrients back into the system so it keeps going around in a cyclical manner. We learned when we talked about photosynthesis that cyclical cycles are more sustainable, but once they become linear, such as taking garbage to the landfill, this cycle stops working. Of course, farmers have ways to replenish the nutrients without organic matter, such as adding fertilizer, which can definitely help increase yields. But if you're never adding organic matter back to the soil, that soil is less able to hold nutrients, and we'll learn about why that is in a little bit. It's called CEC, or cation exchange capacity. Depleted soils are only having minerals in them. Minerals are the main component of soils, but if it's only minerals, that organic matter is being depleted, and that organic matter plays a critical role in soil health. Because those microbes need to eat too, and those microbes need to eat that organic matter, in turn helping the plant. So how does soil form in the first place? Soil forms from the gradual breakdown of rocks through physical weathering, chemical weathering, and biological weathering. Soils are different around the world because there's different interactions with the environment and the parent material, the rocks that soils form from. There's also different climates in different areas, time, and topography. Soil is made up of layers. At the bottom we have the parent material, which is rocks. If you dig a deep enough hole, you'll usually find big rocks. Above that is the subsoil, usually around 12 to 36 inches. The topsoil, which is where much of the roots grow, is 6 to 12 inches. This is a critical area, but the subsoil is important too. The top layer is called the O-horizon, and that's the organic layer, usually only a few inches. Again, that organic layer breaking down those nutrients is incredible for the cycle to continue of the soil being replenished. If you have a bad lawn, you can add topsoil and it can cause an incredible difference in your grass health. Topsoil is very important for plant growth because that's where the roots, especially in plants like grasses, get a lot of their nutrients. Soils have structure, and that structure is important for how plants grow because plants have to dig through with their roots through the soil. If there's massive blocks, it's really hard for certain plants to break through. If it's all single grain, it might be hard for the plants to obtain enough nutrients in that soil. So different soil structures are important to pay attention to. Let's talk a little bit more about what soil structure is. Soil particles are arranged together in little clumps. These are called soil aggregates or PEDs. These arrangements of soil particles sticking together helps the soil particles not become grains, because single grains are very vulnerable to blowing away or becoming in water and washing away through erosion, which is the loss of soil. It's important to increase the structure of your soil, making sure that there's some aggregates, to have stability against erosion, so that your soil doesn't wash or blow away. And these aggregates are important for maintaining air and water space. In your soil, you want space for air and water, or else the plants won't be able to access those really important tools for growing the plant. When you have healthy soil, you have this ratio. You have air space around 20 to 30%, you have water space usually around 20 to 30%, and you have minerals around 45%, and you have this very small portion, but it's critical, which is the organic matter, somewhere between 1 and 5%. These ratios are incredibly important to maintain. Air and water are really important in soils because without them, plants will die. In sandy soils, it's common for there to be a lack of water. We'll cover why that is in just a little bit. In heavy clay soils, it's hard for the water to drain out. The clay is really good at holding onto water, and that causes a lack of air, so the plant roots cannot have cellular respiration, and that can cause the plants to die too. So air and water space are critical for a healthy soil. Let's talk a little bit about sand and clay. Sand particles are very large, and so they let water drain through them very easily. That's why when you build a pond, you use clay. Clay particles are tiny. They can stack together and smush together really tight, and so when you add water, the water does not all drain through. We use clay for building ponds, and oftentimes we put sand on top so that when you're swimming in the pond, it feels nice on the bottom. Clay can feel really sticky. Let's look at what these particles really look like. Clay, it's like little pennies stacking in a jar. And if a water molecule wants to move through this clay, it has to go round and around and around and around. It takes forever, so clay is really good at holding water. Sand, on the other hand, is very big particle sizes, so water is much easily lost through it, so it just washes through. Now we're going to pause to answer a question that's on your worksheet or found in the description below. This is a pie chart showing what is making up this soil. The majority of the soil is minerals. Then we have water and airspace and organic matter, but the majority is minerals. What do you think happened to this soil depicted in this pie chart? Hint, the majority of the graph is minerals. Please pause the video and see what you think. Okay, so what do you think? If you said that the soil had been compacted, you're correct. Think of it this way. You have a bucket of soil, and it has great structure. 25% space for air, 25% space for water. But then you dry that soil out and you push on it really hard. You maybe even put something really heavy like a few rocks and you push down that soil in the bucket. Then the soil will go from, say, 10 inches to 5 inches that's in that soil. So therefore, there's much more minerals. The soil is packed in there. That's sometimes what happens to soil that's in our yard or in our gardens. The soil has been compacted, so there's no more space for air and water. That can cause problems for plants because plants need that air and water space so that they can gather water for their building of structures and for photosynthesis, and they need that airspace for cellular respiration. So soil compaction is a huge problem. It's especially a problem for clay soils, which easily stack like pennies in a jar. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk more about clay soils. Let's now talk about cation exchange capacity. This is the relative ability of soil to attract and hold nutrients, or cations, on the surface of soil particles. So soil, especially clay, has a very negative charge. That way, it can hold on to positive cations that are nutrients for plants. There are some nutrients for plants that are negatively charged, and the soil has other ways to hold on to them. Nutrients for plants that are negatively charged are more vulnerable to leaching, meaning that if you apply them as fertilizer, they can easily be washed away by water because the soil doesn't hold on to them tightly. We'll talk more about that in the nutrients lecture. But cation exchange capacity is something important for you to understand. It's the charge that soil has to hold on to nutrients. The more nutrients soil can hold on to, the less likely they are to become super depleted in important nutrients for plant growth. Different soils have different cation exchange capacity. Soils such as sandy soils with little clay in the soil have a low CEC, say a CEC of 5. Soils that have a lot of clay particles in them have a CEC that's higher, such as 25. Soils that have a lot of sand in them have low cation exchange capacity. Soils with lots of clay have a high CEC, or cation exchange capacity. That means that soils with lots of clay are better at holding on to nutrients. Let's review cation exchange capacity. Soils high in cation exchange capacities are high in clay or high in organic matter. Organic matter is also able to hold on to nutrients really well. The ability to have a higher CEC means that that soil is better able to hold on to nutrients well. So higher the number, the better they are at holding on to those nutrients. When a fertilizer is added, a large amount of that nutrient will be held in the soil. But if it's a low CEC, a lot of that fertilizer will simply wash away. So it's important that you know what your cation exchange capacity of your soil before you apply fertilizer. If your soil has a high CEC, it will be less likely for that nutrient to be wasted. But if you have a sandy soil or a low CEC, a lot of that fertilizer will be washed away and harm the environment. So you have to be really careful when applying fertilizer. Your cation exchange capacity of your soil can determine how often you need to fertilize that soil. Low CEC soils can cause loss of fertilizer or leaching of those nutrients that's in the soil. High CEC soils need fertilizer less often. Nitrogen and potassium leach readily in soils with low CEC, such as sandy soils. Now we're going to talk about soil classification so that you can learn how to decide if your soils are sandy or if they have a lot of CEC, such as clay soils. This is a soil map of the world. You can see that soils are very different around the world, but some regions, even though they're really far away, can have the same soil type. In the US, we have 12 orders of soil that soil scientists use to classify different soils. It's a good idea to go onto the USDA website and learn about these different soils. You can determine what type of soil you have in your area using the USDA soil map. Soils are broken into two different main parts: organic soils that have more than 20% organic matter. Remember that pie chart that we looked at and it only had 5%? Soils that are considered organic soils have more than 20% in that pie chart. That means they have less minerals. You still want those soils to have a lot of mineral and air space. Mineral soils are primarily minerals and have less organic matter. Soil classification is based on how much percent the soil is made up of a certain mineral. The three main minerals in soil are clay, silt, and sand. So if the soil is mainly clay, that minerals that are in that soil are mainly clay, that's considered a clay soil. If it's mostly sand, sandy soil. But there's a soil triangle that we'll learn to use to classify which type of soil you have. It's important to know about each of these minerals so that you can understand how they influence the soil. Do you remember which one was the biggest? Out of clay, silt, and sand, which one is the largest? If you said sand, you're correct. What's about the next one? The next one is silt, and the smallest is clay. We're going to learn about each of these minerals to understand how they influence soil properties. Sand particles are very large. That means that water can flow through them very easily. Silt is an intermediate between clay and sand. It's a little bit smaller, but still lets water through, but not letting the water pass through quite as fast as sand. Clay particles are more uniformly shaped, just like penny shapes, so they can stack together really easily. If you want to determine what type of soil you have, you can send your soil out for a soil test, or you can use this jar test. What you do is you put some of your soil from your yard in this jar, you shake it up really, really good. So inside the jar is your soil and water, so you shake it up really good. Then you let it for a few hours or even 24 hours in the jar, and you let them settle into different areas. Because the sand particles are really heavy, because they're very large, they will sink to the bottom first. Then, because the silt particles are a little bit heavier than clay, then the silt particles will settle. And then finally, after much time, the clay particles will settle. The clay particles are so small that it takes quite a while for them to settle. Then you can see how much sand you have, how much silt you have, and how much clay you have. You can then use this triangle to determine what type of soil you have in your yard. So let's take time to answer question 8 in your sheet or found in the description below. You'll want to pause the video and answer this question. Use the soil triangle to determine what kind of soil each of the following are. A soil with 45% sand, 25% clay, and 30% silt. 15% clay, 60% sand, and 50% clay, and 30% sand. So look at all of these and use this triangle to determine it. We can do one example together so that you make sure you know how to do it. Let's start with the first example. 45% sand, 25% clay, and 30% silt. It's important that you pay attention that these lines are not necessarily straight, so this way they can go completely parallel. But on this silt side, they're at a little bit of an angle. So it's important to pay attention to that. So we're going to start with sand. That's the largest component of this. So it's 45, so we're going to draw this line. When you're taking a test, you can literally draw a pencil mark on it. That's what makes it easier. If you just kind of eyeball it, it sometimes can be hard. How much clay? 25. So we see this 25. And how much silt? 30. So if we kind of go down, we draw a line, and we know that this sand is here, and the clay is 25, being right here. You kind of find this middle point where all of them come together. And what do you think it is? If you drew the lines out, you would definitely find that it's a loam soil. So a soil with 45% sand, 25% clay, and 30% silt is a loam soil. And we did this by lining up these numbers on each of the side of the triangle. Now I want you to take the time to do the other questions on your own. Now that you've done them, did you find that the second one was sandy loam? I hope so. And the third one, did you find that it is clayey soil? That's correct. Now that we know how to determine what type of soil we have using the soil triangle, we're going to get a basic understanding of soils by understanding the basic properties of clay and sand. Remember, the particle sizes of sand and clay are very different. Clay soils are like pennies in a jar. They have lots of surface area because they're very small and there's many particles. They hold water very well because it takes a long time for the water to get through that train. And that causes them to be poor draining. Clays are very sticky. That's why we use clay to build clay pots. You can actually tell if a soil is clay by making a ribbon with the soil. So what you do is you take some of the soil in your hand, add some water to it, and you get your hands dirty and you make a ribbon. Based on how long that ribbon is, without it breaking out of your hands, so if you're forming the ribbon, it just breaks off, crumbles, that probably means that there's not very much clay in that soil. So the longer the distance of the ribbon that you can make, the more clayey that soil is. So a very long ribbon would be clay soil, a little bit shorter would be clay loam, not very much of a ribbon at all would be loam. A very short ribbon would be a sandy loam or a loamy sand. There's some challenges with clay because the particle sizes are so small, it's very easy to compact it. So these, just like the pennies in the jar, when large equipment drive over clay, it can get super compacted. Then once the construction, say, of your house is over and you want to plant a garden in your yard, the particles are so compacted that it's really hard for your plants to break through. It's like a clay pot that it can't break through with its roots. So this has caused some issues if there's been a lot of compaction. the ways that fields or lawns get compacted is by heavy equipment driving on them, especially when the soils are wet. Clay soils are very vulnerable to compaction because when something heavy drives over these penny-like particles, it pushes them together. Another problem with clay is when they are dry, they shrink up, and when they're wet, they expand. And that causes this shrinking and swelling. This is why sometimes sidewalks in areas that the soil is very clayey will be very cracked, because when in the wintertime the water will freeze and then it will cause it to expand, and then when it's dry in the summer it will shrink, and so the sidewalks end up breaking. This is also the cause of this cracked look when it's really dry. That's because of clay soils cracking, because of this property of clay that it shrinks when it's dry and expands when it's wet. This compaction issue can cause a hard pan, and that's when an area has been compacted. Say they build a house, the machinery drive over it a bunch, you have this compaction layer, and then you decide to add some topsoil, because topsoil can help your grass grow really well. And your grass does great, but when you want to grow something that has a larger root system, say a tomato, it just cannot break through this hard pan layer. This can also happen in farmers' fields, because year after year you have a plow hitting the same area of the land, boom, 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 every year, and that can cause a hard pan. So the hard pans can be formed by plows digging up each year at the same spot, hitting the area. There's some techniques that farmers can use to prevent this, such as how they plow their fields, the directions, and the types of plows and chisel plows that they use. Let's talk a little bit more about hard pans, how they're caused, and how to fix them. So where do they come from? They can form naturally or as a result of heavy equipment. So let's just go back here and remind you that it's just this layer of compacted clay. Think of it as a clay pot, okay? So instead of a clay pot, it's just this clay layer. Can you break a clay pot? How do you break it? You just simply hit it really hard with really anything, and the whole thing will kind of crack. So same with this clay layer. We have this layer that we want to break. So what we can actually do is we can hit it really hard. So we can dig a hole and hit it with a post hole digger, what we use to build fences. So if you basically break it, then it kind of cracks. Even though you don't crack it in every area of your garden, if you crack it in a few places, water is going to be able to drain through. Roots are going to be able to break through to obtain nutrients in water as they need to grow. So you can dig through it with the post hole digger. So once I've dug through it with the post hole digger, how do I know if it worked? What you can do is you can dig a hole, just like pretend like you're going to plant a big tree or a big plant, and fill that hole with water. So you've dug a hole, fill it with water. If the layer of clay is still very compacted, that water is not going to get through. But if you successfully broke it and you leave that water for say 30 minutes, it's going to drain out. So if the water that you put into that newly dug hole drains relatively quickly, say in about 30 minutes, then you know that you fixed the problem. If it doesn't drain, then you still have to keep post hole digging and start trying to break it up even more. If you cannot fix this hard pan in your yard, if it's severe enough, you can decide to build raised planters, which are really helpful ways. So you basically build up the area that you want to be your garden, you add more topsoil. This can be an alternative to breaking it open. If it's a problem in your large field, you may want to take preventative measures to prevent it, such as never going into that field with heavy equipment when it's wet, or doing research on how to plow it in a different direction so that you can take care of it. There's an art to breaking up hard pan. The best is just to avoid it from happening in the first place. So clay soils have a great capacity to attract and hold nutrients. Do you remember what that's called? If you said CEC, you're correct. So clay soils have a high cation exchange capacity. Nutrients tend to be stored in clay soils for a long time rather than being washed away by rain or irrigation. Now we're going to talk about sandy soils that we've talked about clay soils a lot. Sandy soils are basically the opposite of clay soils. Every problem that you have with clay, you don't have with sand, and vice versa. So sandy soils do not hold moisture well, they do not compact easily, and they have very low cation exchange capacity. So nutrients wash away from those soils very easily. Sandy soils are very good for growing certain crops, but it's hard to maintain the nutrient levels in those sandy soils. For instance, potatoes are often grown in sandy soils because it's very easy to harvest that potato if it's growing in sandy soils. Sandy soils have round, irregular shape of those particles, so they let water drain much faster, and they do not compact, so they're less vulnerable to compaction. So a mixture of all the different soil types, being clay, silt, and sand, produces loam soils. These loam soils are the best of both worlds because they have the properties of clay, such as being able to hold nutrients really well and be able to hold water, and then the better properties of sand that don't let the soil get compacted. So if you have a loam soil with more clay, you'll have more clay properties and more problems that go along with clay soils. If you have a sandy soil, you'll have more sand properties, more of the problems that go along with sandy soils. No soil is perfect. Different crops do better in different soils. You just have to learn how to manage that soil that you have. So it's important to know what soil types you're working with so that you can treat them with the best practices to maximize their productivity. Loam soils in general are considered ideal for most plants because they lack the extreme bad properties of either one, clay or sand. A mixture of both, you have the best of both worlds. They will not require frequent irrigation. The drainage, because of the sand in there, allows the soil to be workable much faster than clay soils, so it's less vulnerable to compaction. Even if you want to plow that field, it's less vulnerable to hard pan formation. And the clay particles in the soil help hold more nutrients than the sandy soils. And the soil in general, the loam soils in general, are not as prone to becoming big clods, so big groups of soil, basically big chunks of soil in your field, and they're less likely to become compacted like clay soils. So let's talk about some common soil problems and what soils are most vulnerable to them. So what's happening in this soil? What's happening in this lawn? In this lawn, it just rained, and the soil is not draining. It's just sitting there like a pond in your yard. What type of soils particle do you think there's a lot of in this yard? If you said clay soils, you're correct. Clay soils have poor drainage. In this yard, someone drove over and it compacted the area. This can cause issues because the grass might not grow very well there. What type of soil do you think that is with compaction? If you said clay soils, you're correct. This soil has cracking at the top, and you can see that it's shrinking and expanding, and it's causing these cracks. That can make it hard. It's called soil crusting. It can make it hard for plants to germinate. What type of soil do you think we have here? If you said clay, you're correct. Soil crusting is common in clayey soils. In this picture, you see a corn plant that's nutrient deficient. What type of soils have a fertility problem, meaning that they don't hold nutrients very well? If you said a sandy soil, you're correct. And in this last picture, we have soils that look very dry and the plants aren't doing very well. What type of soil do you think it is? If you said sandy soils, you're correct. Now that we've covered common issues associated with different soil types, I want to offer a solution that can help with all of these problems of soils. So one solution can fix all of these, and that is adding organic matter. Adding organic matter can help with each of these issues. For example, clay particles sticking together really solidly, compacted, cannot allow water to go through or cause crusting. Adding organic matter can basically create a buffer so those clay particles do not stick together so much, which causes problems. So adding organic matter can separate those particles a little bit so water can drain, so it can be less vulnerable to compaction and soil crusting. For sand, the problem is the nutrients wash away and the water also washes away. So adding organic matter, which is really high CEC, can hold on to nutrients and water. Organic matter can hold 10 times its weight in water, so it can resolve these issues in sandy soils. So let's talk about the importance of organic matter. Where does organic matter come from? This is a picture of me with my dad and some colleagues that we're working with in Haiti. We have a compost facility in Red Wing, Minnesota. This is our large-scale composting facility, and we're trying to empower people in Haiti to start their own compost facility so that they can recycle their organic matter. So again, where does organic matter come from? It comes from vegetative matter such as leaves, roots, animal products like manure, and that basically mixing it together using microbes to break it down back into compost and then returning that to the soil and replenishing the soil nutrients. Plants can actually be grown in pure organic matter because it has all the nutrients that plants need, but adding it to existing mineral soils can help resolve issues in those mineral soils. Let's talk more and review what adding organic matter does to soils. So this is a picture that my dear sister drew that has soil that does not have organic matter, and this side has organic matter. So what happens? If the soil has organic matter, it can actually absorb water and nutrients deeper into the soil so it can hold more water. If soils are just minerals, especially clay, water can come to the area, such as through rain, but it just washes away and only gets a little bit into the soil. It doesn't get deep into the soil. Plants that are grown that have organic matter can grow much healthier, their roots can go deeper, they can gather more nutrients and water, and when drought times come, when it doesn't rain, these plants will last longer because the soil has more water and nutrients to give, so it doesn't get all dried up. Let's review what adding organic matter does for soil. It increases the water holding capacity, it increases the nutrient holding capacity or the fertility of the soil, it feeds the beneficial microbes in that soil, it increases the effectiveness of fertilizer because fertilizer doesn't just wash away, and it can also help with environmental problems such as erosion, which is the loss of soil. Having organic matter in your soil can reduce erosion. It can also reduce the waste of agriculture inputs such as fertilizer. And it can prevent fertilizer volatilization, which is really bad for the environment, loss of fertilizer to the environment. So what happens when you add organic matter to sandy soils? Just a small percent of organic matter added to sandy soils can increase the cation exchange capacity of sand so that it can hold on to nutrients better. It will also increase the water holding capacity of that sandy soils, which will prevent the plants from having severe water stress. When you add organic matter to clay soils, it improves the drainage and air movement within that soil. So it breaks up the particles so that it can have air movement. It also decreases the compaction and it decreases the plasticity of clay from sticking to itself. The organic matter can also cause aggregation in clay soils, which can be a good thing. Let's review what soil aggregates are. Soil aggregates are groups of soil particles that bind to each other more strongly than to adjacent particles. The space between aggregates provides pore space for retention and exchange of air and water. This is a graphic of soil aggregates. You can see the different soil particles being tightly adhered together so that there is space for air and water. Let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in these aggregates. These aggregates have incredibly interesting structure. It's not only soil particles that make them up, but also microorganisms that are helping break down things. When organic matter is added to the soil, these microorganisms can help decompose organic matter. That results in humic acid, and humic acid acts as a glue, causes these particles to stick together, and also provides space so that air and water can move through the soil. So these aggregates are incredibly important. Soil aggregates should not be broken up too much because they ensure that there's air and water space for the roots to grow and to obtain water and as well as oxygen. Let's specifically talk about aggregates in clay soils. Since clay particles are so tiny, it's really important that they are in aggregates, or else there won't be room for air and water space, and the plants won't be able to grow. Because clay is so vulnerable to formation of bad aggregates, which is, for example, that layer of hard compacted clay that we call hardpan, we had to be really careful when we work with clay. Because the clay aggregates are so important, or else the clay soils aren't healthy, and they're very vulnerable to compaction. So it's very important that you're really careful with your clay fields. That means that you do not plow clay fields when they're wet. If you plow clay when it's wet, you'll completely ruin the structure and that will result in your field not being successful in the next season. When is it okay to plow a clay field? When the clay is dry and crumbles in your hand, that means that the plow will simply crumble the clay and break it up a little bit and not ruin the structure completely. If you plow a wet field, a wet clay field, you'll basically result in a bunch of big chunks of clay that your roots will not be able to get through. And that's like having a bunch of huge clay pots in your field. It wouldn't be very helpful for growing a successful crop. So make sure that you never plow clay fields when wet. Make sure that that soil crumbles easily in your hand, is super dry before you plow it. Be careful of clay fields when you're harvesting or doing other things in that clay field because they're very, very vulnerable to compaction. Another benefit to adding organic matter to clay soils is that the clay soils will be less vulnerable to soil cracking. That results in your seeds not being able to germinate and get through that. Basically form these clay pots on top of the soil and then your seeds can't get through. So make sure to be careful when working with clay soils, and adding organic matter can help with these problems. In summary, regarding our topic of organic matter, adding organic matter to clay soils can help with drainage issues, compaction issues, and soil crusting issues. Adding organic matter to sandy soils can help with nutrient issues such as nutrient loss because sand isn't good at holding onto nutrients. And adding organic matter can help with sandy soils that are really dry because organic matter can increase the water holding capacity of those soils. Now we're going to discuss water movement in soil. Water movement in soil can go down, sideways, or even upward. And that's because of the capillary action of water. Remember when we talked about water uptake in plants? We learned about the amazing water properties such as adhesion and cohesion. Adhesion is water just sticking to things such as soil particles, and cohesion is the property of water sticking to itself. These graphics explain water movement in soil. When it rains, water moves downward from a high water potential to a low water potential. Remember when we learned about diffusion when we talked about photosynthesis? We learned that things move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So a high water potential to a low water potential is how water moves. When it's not raining and the plant is uptaking water, or water is being evaporated just from the soil surface, there's a higher amount of water deep into the soil than at the surface. That means there's a high water potential and a low water potential, and we know that water moves from a high water potential to a low water potential. This means that water is moving against gravity to move upward. Soil water can also move side to side, from a high water potential to a low water potential. It's important to remember that water movement happens every which way in soils, meaning that the water goes where it is needed most. Roots can also respond to where the water is and grow towards water. There are some terms to explain how much water is in your soil. We're going to go over these terms and you'll become familiar with them. Let's start when it just rains. Or you just watered your pot. So if you have your pot and you fill it full of water, you'll often have water coming out the bottom. That's why it's important to have something underneath to capture that water. That water that flows out of the bottom is called gravitational water. That water is not being held by the soil particles. When you've just watered your pot, or it just rained a lot, or you irrigated your field a lot, the soil is said to be saturated. The gravitational water flows out the bottom of your pot or flows into the watershed of your field, into rivers and streams, etc. Once this gravitational water has gone away, we have field capacity, or how much the soil can actually hold. That capillary water, that water that's held tightly to the soil particles, is available to the plant. It's called capillary water because capillary action, adhesion and cohesion, the adhesion properties of water making those water molecules stick to the soil particles, and the cohesion properties of water making those water molecules stick to each other so that they can basically be held within that soil. This soil is said to be at field capacity. This is what your pot is after you watered it and the water drained out, and after a few hours after a rain. The available water for plants is between field capacity and permanent wilting point. Let me explain this more. When this water is available, plants will uptake this water. And if they keep using the water and it doesn't rain or you don't water the plant, the water will become very sparse in that soil. There'll be a lot of airspace, but not very much water in that airspace. The water that is still in that soil, there's still a little bit of water in that soil, is held so tightly by the soil particles the plant can't use it. If left at permanent wilting point, your plant will wilt permanently and not recover. So we don't want our plants to become wilted and die. So we try to avoid the permanent wilting point. This space between permanent wilting point and field capacity is that water that the plants have available for them to use. Let's review these terms. Saturated soil is if water is added to the soil with a thorough rainfall or irrigation. Gravitational water is excess water that leaves the system, washes away. Field capacity is when excess water drains and the soil is holding all the water it can. Permanent wilting point is when water evaporates or the plant absorbs it. The water content drops until none is left that the plant can use. Hygroscopic water is the water that's held so tightly by the soil that the plant can't use it. And available water is this water in between field capacity and permanent wilting point that plants use to grow. Now that you know and understand these terms, we're going to move on to talk about soil loss through erosion. Erosion is the movement of soil particles from one place to another. This means that our soil particles are being lost somewhere else into the environment, and that can happen through water erosion, such as a large rain, improper irrigation, or flooding. Water erosion can be detrimental. If you have these big washouts in your field, your tractor can break, or your plants will in your garden will just not be as successful. It's really important to reduce water erosion. Wind erosion can also be a huge problem, moving soil particles from one area to another through wind. Erosion is detrimental to the fertility and health of your soil. It's caused mainly by water and wind. It's worse on steep banks where water erosion will result in the movement of soil from the top of the bank to the bottom, top of the hill to the bottom. To minimize erosion, it's important to cover your soil with some type of plant that has an extensive root system to hold onto the soil. Extensive fibrous root systems spread and grow into the soil, making sure that it doesn't wash or blow away. You should also reduce soil disturbance. That means that you shouldn't dig soil up when it's not necessary. Be careful when you plow your field or till your garden. When you do need to disturb the soil, such as planting a plant, don't disturb a whole acre to plant one tree. Just disturb that one area that you're planting. Prepare individual planting holes for plants. Plant immediately after preparation so that that root system can start developing and hold on to that soil. Mulching soil can also stabilize soil and prevent erosion. When you set up irrigation systems or decide to irrigate your plants, be careful and make sure to reduce runoff by not watering too much. Now that you know the water terms, you want to keep your soil at field capacity, but you don't want lots of gravitational water. Soil erosion can be detrimental to your plant health for many different reasons, one of which is that nutrients are washed away or blown away. These nutrients are essential for plant growth. There are 17 nutrients that plants need to grow. We're going to talk more about these in a later lecture, but for a quick overview, there's nutrients that are macronutrients that plants need a lot of to grow, such as nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then there's micronutrients that plants need a little of, but are incredibly important for their growth. When you're managing soil, it's important to manage these nutrients so that plants can grow healthy, so that they have enough. Basically, you're providing them with enough to eat. Just as it was important for us to understand how water moved in soil, it's also important for us to think about how nutrients are moving in our soil so that we can act accordingly. For example, nitrogen moves very fast in sandy soils. So when you apply nitrogen to sandy soils, it's very possible if you add too much at the wrong time, it can get into the groundwater, which can cause environmental issues. The movement of nitrogen in clay soils, it's much slower. So your soil type also determines what your CEC, the relative ability to hold on nutrients, and different soils have different movement of different nutrients. So it's a very important thing to consider when thinking about nutrient management. When you're trying to manage micronutrients, it's really important to consider the pH, because different micronutrients are not available to plants if the pH of the soil is wrong. Let's talk about soil pH. You're probably familiar with the pH scale. Things that are really acidic, like lemon juice or the acids that are in your stomach, and things that are more basic, such as bleach or hand soap. Things that are neutral are things like pure water. Plants like to grow somewhere around 6 to 8 pH. This is ideal for plant growth. The pH scale measures how acidic or alkaline things are. It's a measurement on a logarithmic scale from 0 to 14. A soil pH below 4 or above 9 is uncommon, so most of the time we'll have a pretty neutral soil. A pH of 6 on the logarithmic scale is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 7. So when you're talking about pHs, even just one number difference can make it a lot more acidic or a lot more alkaline, and that can alter plant growth. A pH scale of 5 is 100 times more acidic than a pH of 7. So paying attention to pH of your soil is incredibly important. Just a small change can make a big difference for plant growth. pH alters the availability of plant nutrients to plants. So if the pH is off, the plant won't be able to obtain nutrients that they need. Most plants are adapted to a certain pH. The optimal range for most plants is 6.5 to 7. Plants adapted to lower pH soils are called acid-loving plants. Other plants are tolerant to alkaline soils. pH of your soil can be altered. So if you have a bad pH of soil, it can make your plants grow really bad. But if you improve it by changing the pH, you can improve your plant growth. How do you increase or change your pH? So there's two different ways that you need to change your pH. Either you need to increase it, making it less acidic, or you need to make it more acidic. So let's talk about the first, more common one right now. A lot of times you'll have a soil that is really acidic. So say a pH of 4 and you need to move it to a 6. So you need to increase the soil pH, or in other words, make it less acidic. You can use limestone. Adding ground limestone is the most common and least expensive way to make your soil less acidic. You can also use dolomitic limestone, and that also provides magnesium, which is sometimes a necessary nutrient lacking in some soils. It will take anywhere from 3 to 6 months to accomplish a pH change. Due to the slow speed which limestone dissolves, you can get limestone that's more finely ground, and you can have a faster change of pH. Now let's talk about lowering soil pH, making it more acidic. This is less common because soils are often too acidic for plant growth. But if your soils are too alkaline and you need to make them more acidic, there's ways to do that. You can add aluminum sulfate or organic amendments such as oak leaves and pine needles. Be careful though, because too much aluminum sulfate can cause aluminum toxicity in your soil, which you do not want. And if you're going to use oak leaves and pine needles, just remember it's going to take a large quantities of these items to change the pH. Fertilizers such as ammonium or potassium sulfates can also acidify your soils, so you can use these as well. Large amounts of these fertilizers can actually cause problems. You don't want to damage your plant health by adding too much of these, so you have to be careful. Now that we've talked about changing pH and the dangers of the wrong pH not allowing your plants to get nutrients, you may be wondering about your own soil pH. Well, if you're wondering about your soil pH or your soil nutrients, you can get your soil tested. It's the best way to determine if you have a pH issue or if you have a nutrient issue that's harming your plant health. How you get a soil test depends on where you live, so it's important to do research. If you live in the United States, you usually can contact your local cooperative extension service, and they will be able to point you in the right direction of where to get your soil tested, and they might be able to do it themselves for a small fee. If you're going to do a soil test, no matter where you live, it's important to know the following steps. How to take a good soil sample. Let's talk about taking a good soil sample. You get charged by the soil sample, so it's important that you are careful to take a very good sample. You'll want to make a map of the area that you want to sample, such as your garden. This is an example map of a garden. You don't want to take one sample because right here there might be something going on. The little area of soil that you took might be really acidic, but your whole garden in general may have the right pH. So what you want to do is you want to make a map and have random dots on the map, or a grid shape like I've done. What you want to do is you want to take multiple samples from each of the labeled points, put it in a bucket, mix it up, and then take a sample of that. This is called a subsample. So you're taking an average of your whole garden instead of just one little area. That's too risky. So what you do in each of these sample areas is you either use a soil probe if you have one, or you take a thin slice of soil from each of these areas. So you dig a 6 to 8 inch deep hole and you skim off just a ½ inch of that all the way down. This is the best way to do it because you don't want to just take soil from the top here. You don't want to take soil just from the bottom here. You want to take it just a good sample all the way through. You want to take at least a dozen of these samples and combine them in a big bucket, stir it around, and then depending on where you're getting your soil tested, they'll usually ask for a ½ liter sample, put it in a bag, and you send it into them. So you want to take a bunch of these little samples, add them together, mix them up, so you're doing a subsample. This helps you make a more accurate determination of what your soil looks like in your garden. Once you submit your soil sample, after a little while you'll get your diagnosis. This is like the report that you get from the doctor. They'll tell you your pH of your soil and the amount of nutrients that are in your soil. When you submit your soil, you usually have to submit a checklist of what you want them to check for, and the prices will be on it. So certain things cost more for them to determine because they have to run certain lab tests. So you'll want to pay attention to what you're actually getting sampled for. They'll also sometimes, depending on the county office, they'll provide you with recommendations of what to do with your soil, or you can talk to somebody that may know more about soil than you. It's okay to ask for help for reading these results so that you can make the best changes to your soil to improve your plant growth. Once you get your diagnostics back, you might want to add certain things to your soil, such as things to change the pH, or adding more nutrients, or adding organic matter, which we've discussed can help your soil health a lot. Let's review what we've covered so far today. We talked all about soil science and how important keeping soils healthy is to improve plant health. We talked about soils giving us so much, such as the produce that we eat, grasses that animals eat, and how much we enjoy the produce coming from plants. We also talked about how important it is to return that organic matter back into the soil because there's microbes that use those nutrients and convert them into compost, which can then be used for plant growth. We dove in deeper talking about how this organic matter can help the soil structure. It can help keep bacteria in the soil healthy, and it can also increase the water holding capacity of soil, drainage, and aggregation. When we talked about aggregates, we talked about soil microorganisms helping break down organic matter and then helping those aggregates stick together so that there's space for air and water movement in soil. Soil microorganisms are also incredibly important for plant health because they help the plant obtain certain nutrients through their roots. Soil microorganisms are incredibly important for keeping soil healthy. Overall, today we covered a lot of important properties of soil. We talked about soil systems and how it's really important to keep the cycle moving. We also talked about cool soil properties such as structure, cation exchange capacity, and the importance of air and water space. We also talked about how to classify soils using the soil triangle. We talked about the different soil mineral types and that each one has their pros and cons, and that there's a combination called loam that makes the best soil for most plants. We also talked about adding organic matter to soil and how that can help with improving water holding capacity and prevent compaction. We talked about soil water movement and soil loss, which is called erosion. We also covered briefly soil nutrients, managing soil pH, and how incredibly important soil microbes are in keeping soils healthy. In summary, I have some questions that I want you to answer on your own or with your partner. What are the functions of soil? For the plant and for the environment. Why is soil a valuable resource? How do we as humans abuse soil, and what can we do to improve soil health and food security? Question number 12. Use the following graphic to brainstorm and then label the puzzle pieces of soil health. Be unique and do not copy others or mine. Managing soil health is incredibly important to feed the future generation. Managing different soils is different depending on your soil type. As we learned, the challenges with clay soils are different than the challenges of sandy soils. No matter where you live or what soil amount you have to manage, you have a role to play in improving soil health for the future generation. Think about how you can manage the soil in your own community or encourage others to increase soil health. The health of our soils are incredibly important for the future food security of our planet. I hope today helped you understand the science underpinning soils and got you interested in being an advocate for improving soil health. As always, feel free to email me with questions or comments or reply below. Have an excellent day.